And we are, as a people, inherently and historically
Wake up.
opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
The show that asks questions about why we don't ask questions.
What the hell is going on?
This is Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Welcome to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. These are Conspiracy Queries, and I'm Alan Park. You have the right station. You have the right show. This is, it's the month that Kennedy was killed. John F. Kennedy, 50 years ago this month. Perhaps the very moment that you're listening to this program. It's the 50th anniversary, and our guest today is an author, Mark Shaw. He has a book called The Poison Patriarch, and I think you'll find it very different compared to a lot of other Kennedy books and research works, because what Mark does is he very clearly points the finger of blame upon Joe Kennedy. Who's that? JFK's dad. It's a good book. It's very interesting, so stick around for that. But before we get into that, I have to say that we broadcast from Toronto, Canada. And if you've never heard of Toronto before, I'm sure you have now, because we have a bumbling goofball of a mayor who's holding us all for ransom in a garage and making us smoke crack. That's what he's doing. They're not getting into that on the news, but he's actually coming around to people's homes and he's holding a gun to our heads that was provided by a Somali crime gang and making us all smoke crack. So if you can help us send a team up here to get us out of trouble, I'd really appreciate it, because I don't like the taste of it. It's very tinny. But moving on to more serious matters, boy, oh boy. Fukushima is a bit of a mess. Would be an understatement of the century. They have started to, when I say they, I mean the Japanese TEPCO, the government, and the Japanese people are crossing their fingers while they try to unload these 1,400 plus, I think it's 1,433, 600 kilogram rods that are all irradiated that they have to keep in water, because if they don't, there'll be a meltdown. And they have to move them somewhere. Do we have any experts around that could help us with that? No? All right. Well, maybe instead of drumming up wars and crashing military drones from the U.S. into the Lake Ontario, maybe we could focus a little bit more on the safe removal of those rods and transferring them to wherever they have to go so that we don't all die. But no one seems to be on that, really. The Japanese have started to move those rods out of the endangered tank that needs to be cleaned out and taken apart before it falls apart. And yet, what has happened is, for the second time in 2 weeks, Japan has had another powerful earthquake relatively near Fukushima. So, this is from the website news.com.au from Australia, and they're relatively close to Japan, say, compared to North America. A 5.7 magnitude earthquake has hit eastern Japan. The quake struck at 4:30 a.m. local time a couple of days ago. If you're listening to this, the tremor struck down at a depth of 332 kilometers. There are no initial reports of damage. Japan lies on the so-called Ring of Fire and a series of seismic fault lines encircling the Pacific Ocean, which create frequent seismic and volcanic activity. Great place to put a series of nuclear reactors on, I say, with great dismay. Earthquakes happening at the same time they are trying to save our lives by moving these rods around. Very uncomfortable. The rods at the stricken nuclear power facility are, let's put it this way, it's in worse shape now than it was when the earthquake hit. So let that sink in for a second. worse shape now than it was before, and far less media coverage than when it initially happened. I don't know why that is. That's a query of a conspiracy that no one seems to be asking. Canada's very well-known scientist, media fixture, David Suzuki, has issued a frightening little warning about Fukushima, saying that if it does fall in a future earthquake, it's, quote, bye-bye Japan. And the entire west coast of North America should be evacuated. So hopefully, if that earthquake has happened and Japan has disappeared, you're not listening to the show right now. You should be fleeing to the central or eastern part of North America. Very scary news indeed. Hopefully, we will be able to sort it out. I say that in all sincerity. But I'm not sure we'll be able to do that on this show. As I say, we do have a great show with a fascinating guest. And you may also be able to contact my guest today at The Mark Shaw on Twitter or at markshawbooks.com to pick up your copy of Poison Patriarch. So let's go now to the interview with Mark Shaw. I am very happy to be speaking with Mark Shaw, and I'll tell you why. Mark Shaw has written a book. Of course, we're continuing our look at the assassination of JFK this month. It's the 22nd of November, and we've done a few shows on this topic, and we will continue to do so because, in my mind, it is a seminal moment in our history, and things have spun, I think, in a negative way ever since that day happened. And it's been 50 years, and no one really actually seems to know the answer. And people that do seem to know the answer they conflict with each other. And that's okay. Everyone's trying to get to the bottom of the matter. But Mark Shaw is on the show today, and he has written a book, Poison Patriarch. And if you don't know what a patriarch is, you're probably listening to the wrong show. But a patriarch is the head of the family. And Mark's book, Poison Patriarch, pretty much fingers JFK's dad, Joe Kennedy, as complicit at the very least in the assassination of his own son. And this is an angle I have not heard before, I have not come across, and so it's fascinating to me. No end. So here he is. Mark Shaw, tell us about your book, Poison Patriarch. How did you come to this conclusion, Mark?
Well, it's most interesting. I guess I have kind of an advantage. I'm a former criminal defense lawyer, and I've analyzed high-profile cases on the network. So I have that background, gone up against great prosecutors, and so I know about that. And then in the mid-1980s, I knew a man in San Francisco, a lawyer named Melvin Belli, who was the most famous lawyer at the time, maybe in the 20th century, really, and wrote a biography of him called King of the Courtroom that was published in 2007. And during that investigation and that research for that book, I started learning about Belli's representation of Jack Ruby, who in many ways is kind of an overlooked character, I think. We look at Oswald, we look at why JFK was killed, but nobody's really looked at Jack Ruby, and he was a pivotal part of all of that happened 50 years ago. So when I was investigating Belli, the first thing I found out was, he was a personal injury lawyer. Well, why in the world did he become Jack Ruby's criminal defense lawyer when there were so many other people available? He told conflicting stories about how he had become Ruby's lawyer in 2 books. He used an insanity defense. It didn't make a lot of sense when he could have thrown Ruby on the mercy of the jury and probably gotten him a few years in prison. Belli was a mob wannabe. His main client at the time was Mickey Cohen, the L.A. gangster. And so all of that kind of came together, and then it was most interesting because Belli was a blabbermouth. He liked to talk about everything, and everybody I interviewed, colleagues, friends, ex-wives, whoever they were, said one thing: Belli would never talk about the Ruby case. And that really, caused some red flags in my mind, and then I followed that on through, and as people will see in the book, I can connect Melvin Belli and Jack Ruby on up the ladder towards Joseph Kennedy.
Right. Now, Melvin Belli also, he became somewhat famous, even more so later on. He defended people like Jim and Tammy Baker, the disgraced evangelists. And
Muhammad Ali, Errol Flynn, the actor, the Rolling Stones. I mean, Belli had about all the big clients, but none of those cases involved really being a criminal defense lawyer. So that piqued my interest for sure.
How did Melvin Belli then become the lawyer for Jack Ruby, who most people would say they saw Jack Ruby on television performing, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but killing Lee Harvey Oswald, the prime suspect in the JFK assassination?
All right, well, let me lay out for you what I do in the book, kind of as a prosecutor laying it out for a jury, and I'll do it very quickly. Joe Kennedy wanted to be president. He had been made ambassador to Great Britain after he'd accumulated great wealth through kind of some shady dealings on Wall Street, and also through his bootlegging operations with Mafia help. In those years when that was very profitable, and so Joe had all the money and power, and then he was appointed ambassador to England, and it looked like he was going to come back and run for president. Well, he ran into trouble when he appeased the Nazis, kind of patted Hitler on the back, and advocated isolationism. The United States should stay out of the war. Well, the FDR didn't like that and ripped him back to the United States, basically fired him. Well, Joe's reputation was in shambles, and he basically said, well, listen, if I can't be president, I'll make one of my sons president. It was going to be Joe Kennedy Jr., but he was killed in the war. So who's next? John. He promotes John with his money and power into the Massachusetts senatorial position, and then next, of course, is the presidency. Well, in 1960, when Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon, it was a very close race, you may remember.
Yes.
And there were two states, Illinois and West Virginia, that were really up for grabs, and whoever won those states would probably win the election. Joe needed those states, and so he called in some of the money and the power that some of his former associates had, those people connected with the Mafia. And those guys came in with the understanding that if they helped JFK become president, then when the new administration, JFK's administration, took place, they would be left alone. It's a pact that I say Joe made with the devil. But those people helped him, and JFK became president. And then in a decision that I believe changed the course of history. And I have an eyewitness, or more than 40 eyewitnesses in this book, never published before. There was a witness right there when Joe Kennedy ordered, basically, Jack Kennedy to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And Bobby Kennedy had gone after the mobsters before as part of the McClellan Committee on, the Mafia and all of that. And so when he became Attorney General, he went after the same guys again. And among those were Sam Giancana and Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Santo Trafficante, and others. Well, the Mafia guys felt like they had been double-crossed. And in my opinion, one of them, Marcello, as 1963 approached, was desperate. Bobby Kennedy was trying to deport him. He had charged him with conspiracy, and a trial was pending in New Orleans. And I believe, based on the evidence that I present in the book, the fresh evidence, that Marcello orchestrated the JFK assassination. He used soldiers that he had from both New Orleans and from Dallas, where his empire stretched, and one of them happened to be Lee Harvey Oswald, who is a murky character at best. I'm just about done here, but I'll tie this all up.
Oh, no, go on.
That when Oswald was arrested, there's a loose end. And so in true Mafia tradition, you've got to tie up that loose end. And what did he do? He brought in a Mafia wannabe like Jack Ruby in Dallas, guy that wanted to be a big shot, and using the Dallas police connections that they had, they snuck Ruby into that Dallas Police Department basement, and the photo that everybody remembers on television, of course, is Ruby shooting Oswald. But now you've got a problem because Ruby is able to possibly talk about who ordered him to kill Oswald. So again, in true Mafia tradition, you bring somebody in to silence Jack Ruby. And who better than Mickey Cohen's lawyer, Melvin Belli. Belli was brought into the case, in my opinion, with orders that he would, one, never let Ruby testify, which was exactly what happened, and second, portray him as crazy, so that if he ever did say anything to anybody after the trial, nobody would believe him. And that's exactly what happened. Ruby was convicted, he was portrayed as crazy, and even when he talked to the Warren Commission, they discounted anything that he said. Exit strategy, case is closed, it's over, there are no loose ends, except for Melvin Belli, who knew well enough through his contacts and his experience
his connections,
with the Mafia to keep to never say a word about what happened. So I think that's the scenario. It's a common sense scenario based on motive. There's no sensationalism. There's no entertainment value. There's no rumor speculation. Basically, I think that's what happened back in 1963.
Now, when you look at the different reasons why JFK would be killed, how were you? Is this looking into Melvin Belli and your work as a trial lawyer yourself? That's your main to realize that this is what's gone on, and specifically what I'm talking about is, Kennedy was he brought in money that wasn't from the Federal Reserve. And then there were just so many different motives for so many different people to kill him. The mob, the FBI, he threatened to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces after the Bay of Pigs. He warned of the impending conspiracy in that famous speech of his that I actually use a portion of that to open the show. There were so many people, but you're 100% comfortable yourself, Mark Shaw, that this was the work of the mob through Melvin Belli.
Yeah, and I think a prosecutor could take the fresh evidence that I have and convict those who were involved in the assassination. The detective's best friends are motive, means, opportunity, and benefit from the crime. If you line those up with the one man who hated hated Bobby Kennedy the most, the one who had the most to lose, the one who was desperate and had no alternatives, his deportation appeals were over. I dug that up in a New Orleans paper. He was facing the criminal conspiracy trial. He had to act. And simple common sense motive was there. The means, he certainly had those soldiers available to him both in New Orleans and Dallas. Opportunity, it was a gift that Kennedy was paraded through Daley Plaza where there wasn't much of an exit. And then benefit from the crime. There are other authors and experts that'll say others benefit from the crime, but nobody benefited like Carlos Marcello. People have to understand, why didn't he kill Bobby Kennedy? Well, the reason was, if you kill Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy comes after you with everything the government has. But if you kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy is powerless. And that's exactly what happened. He withdrew from public, from the public eye. He finally resigned his attorney generalship and went on with other things and never bothered those guys again. And Marcello was free to do what he wanted to with a multi-million-dollar empire. So I think the thread that we have in the book, the connection between everybody, can be laid out for a jury. And I would just ask those that read the book to keep an open mind and see whether or not they can find holes in what is certainly a circumstantial evidence case where everything has to link up.
I'm speaking with Mark Shaw. He's the author of the book Poison Patriarch. Mark, later on, a few years down the road, Bobby Kennedy was killed. Is this a continuation of the same process?
No, it's not. Again, I don't get into Lee Harvey Oswald much in the book because I think he's a murky character, and Sirhan is certainly that as well. What you have to do is listen, and this case should have been solved a long time ago. There's no connection, I think, with any of that. I think you have to focus on why Bobby wasn't killed and instead of why JFK was. And when you do that, as you'll read in the book, Bobby Kennedy told us who killed his brother. He's told us way back when. It's been in excerpts have been slivered in other books, but never brought together like they are in this book, because there's one quote: when J. Edgar Hoover informed Bobby that JFK was dead, what did Bobby say to his press secretary who was sitting right there? He said, "You know, there was so much bitterness. I thought they would get one of us. I thought it would be me." And then to Richard Goodwin, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the great historian's husband. One night, he says, RFK was talking to him and said, basically, I know who it was. It was the one mobster in New Orleans, meaning Marcello. So basically, Bobby Kennedy, confirms what I say in the book. And that's just common sense again, logic, that you look at the one man who hated the Kennedys the most, especially Bobby, and who had the most to gain.
All right, which brings me to the question, if that's the way it was, and it's pretty cut and dried, and you're comfortable that a competent prosecutor would be able to put that together with the evidence that you supply in today's day and age, why or how did the Warren Commission final report contain the conclusion that you have in your book and is also, of course, available elsewhere? The commission has found no evidence that either Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby was part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate President Kennedy. So does that mean that the commission knows full well and is covering up for the mob?
No, I don't think so. For 50 years, I think people have been looking at in the wrong direction. And I say that in a humble way, but I believe it. You know, J. Edgar Hoover was a very, very smart man, if you know much about him. He played both sides of the angle, of the aisle. Joe Kennedy, in fact, was a kind of an agent for the FBI at one point. They were close friends. He hated the Kennedys. He didn't care for them. Hoover didn't. And, when he told Bobby Kennedy that JFK was dead, it was probably with a smile on his face because he didn't like any of those guys. But what did he do? His reputation is at stake. So the first thing he does is he says when Oswald is captured, it is Oswald and it is Oswald alone. And there is nobody else involved. And the Dallas police chief, who's also embarrassed, backs that up. And so it turns everybody's head in the wrong direction toward this murky character, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that has been going on for 50 years. And it was the fact that the Warren Commission then, after that, basically just was in lockstep. I think they all wanted to, what happens now, for instance, today, when there's a killing? People wonder, were there more people involved? Well, the easiest thing for the government to say is no, because they don't want to frighten people. They don't want to think there are killers still out there. And so this is what happened back there in '63. Hoover wanted to make sure that everybody was calm, that they would settle down from this tragedy. And the easiest way to do that, if you think about it with common sense, is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And that myth, in my opinion, has been, kept on going through the 50 years with Vincent Bugliosi writing his book and Gerald Posner writing his book. And, avoiding really what most people believe with any common sense is that Oswald could never have possibly pulled off this crime by himself. But when you focus on Lee Harvey Oswald, you look in the wrong direction. When you focus on why JFK was killed, you look in the wrong direction. You've got to look back at why Bobby wasn't killed, and then I think at the Ruby Belli connection, and that clears the picture up as to what really occurred.
You spend a lot of time in your book talking about the mob and or the Mafia or La Cosa Nostra, whatever people are comfortable with. Right. Tell us about Frank Regano, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, you are. Regano, whichever you want to say. It's interesting because it seemed like that whatever spirit controls my life, and I'm a big believer in that, every time I got to a particular point with my investigation, something new would come up. I learned about this book, Mob Lawyer, published in 1994 by Frank Regano, the attorney for Marcello, Santo Trafficante, the Tampa Don, and James Hoffa. And in there, I read that when Regano hired Melvin Belli to become his lawyer in a libel case against Time magazine, Santo Trafficante said to Regano, according to Regano, "I'm surprised Melvin Belli would become your lawyer." And Regano said, "Well, why is that?" And Trafficante said, "Well, I don't want to go into it, but the quote is, whatever you do, don't ask Melvin Belli about the Jack Ruby case. It's none of your business. And there's some other quotes in there about that, of Regano being told, leave that alone. Well, these are the little slices in a cold case like this. You've got to look for these small bits of information that come along tying up things, and I thought that was a very significant quote. And the other thing that Regano brought to me and reminded me of was how dangerous the Mafia can be when you double-cross them. And here's a good example, quickly. In the late 70s, I was a correspondent for Good Morning America. They sent me to Philadelphia, and I interviewed Angelo Bruno, a Philadelphia Don's lawyer, about the Mafia getting into Atlantic City. I sat down with him, and this lawyer gave me some really good insight, and I was kind of surprised, and that program then aired the next morning on Good Morning America. The producers loved that spot, and they said, Mark, would you please see whether he'll talk to you again? I called that office of the lawyer, and the woman answered, and she was very quiet. I said, listen, I'd like to talk to Mr. whatever his name was. I've forgotten his name. And she said, and it was kind of quiet, and then it was real silence, and then I could tell she was crying. And I said, are you okay? And she said, well, Mr. Shaw, I guess you don't know. They blew him up in his car this morning.
Wow.
And I even shiver now when I think of that. You can't mess with those guys. You can't double-cross them. And when Joe Kennedy, people say to me, wait, would Joe Kennedy really do that knowing that the possibilities were there? Well, the Kennedys have always felt they could get away with things, bless their hearts. They played by different rules. They were immune to things. Their actions didn't cause consequences. Well, when JFK was killed, I know Bobby knew it was his enemies that had killed JFK, and I believe Joe knew as well. Because, in their minds with the Mafia, you make a deal, you shake hands, whatever it may be, and you better do your part. And when you don't, just like that lawyer in Philadelphia, when he talked too much to me, they're gonna do something about it, and these are dangerous men. They don't mess around. And
so you didn't experience any repercussions from them because even though you were the conduit for his information, you hadn't double-crossed anyone.
Well, it bothered me. I'll tell you that. At the time, I was in New York City, and I was real careful for a little while. Because, again, I didn't know whether they felt like that I had caused this to occur or whatever that way. And fortunately, nothing happened, and I flew back. I was living in Colorado at the time. I flew back there. But, it just opened up for me my eyes in terms of what can happen. And you read about it all the time, even today, how the Mafia takes care of their own. That bond of omerta, the silence is something, and I think that's one reason why Melvin Belli never talked about the Ruby case. He knew better than to do so.
All right. Now, I enjoyed this very much, your book, as much of it as I've read, which is about 4/5 of it. The Melvin Belli's Strange Defense of Ruby. This is, of course, Melvin Belli painting Ruby to be less than having all his marbles, shall we say.
Yes. Yes, and with that, again, these eyewitnesses that I have, I really tried to be careful. There's not speculation in the book. These people were there. 93 years old now in Dallas, Texas. I'm speaking at a JFK conference on Thursday, and I believe he's going to join me. Bill Alexander, main prosecutor of Jack Ruby, still practicing law today.
Wow.
He told me, he said, two things that I'll bring up. One, I thought at the time, I was surprised at the time that JFK got killed. I'd heard it was going to be Bobby based on his enemies. And then he laid out for me the surprise that he had with Melvin Belli's defense, which made no sense to anyone, and obviously the jury didn't buy it because they convicted Ruby. But in the book you'll see, or maybe you have, that Bill Alexander lays out what he would have done to defend Jack Ruby. Bring him in, ask him the questions as to why he did what he did, throw him on the mercy of the court, and as Alexander says, he might have gotten 2 or 3 years in prison. You have to recall, at that time, with Oswald being pinpointed as the killer, Ruby had shot what was the most hated man in the world. And a first-year lawyer could have taken Ruby in there and throw him on the mercy of the court, got him a few years in prison, but not Belli, because he had his orders. Don't let Ruby testify, portray him as crazy, and he'll never be believed if he ever says anything about this. So, I have real problems with the constitutional rights to fair counsel that Ruby had. And in fact, you may know, I've written a letter to the House Judiciary Committee asking them to reopen the JFK assassination to evaluate my evidence as well as other people's new evidence to try to get to the bottom of what really happened 50 years ago.
Because many people do believe that the final version, the final verdict from the government's point of view is that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, case closed. But in the late 70s, there was the House investigation into assassinations, and they ruled that it was, in fact, a conspiracy. They didn't get into details because, I guess for the same reason they didn't in the first place. But the official government position is that it was, in fact, a conspiracy.
Yes, and that 70s investigation did uncover a great amount of new evidence, and just as I think has happened in the last few years now, and that should be gathered and evaluated. But it's dismissed by many people. There's all these conspiracy theories now, and it's tough for me to get a voice. I frankly really appreciate your having me on the program, because much of the liberal media, for instance, they don't want to hear about Joe Kennedy being responsible or Bobby being responsible or whatever. I'm not so sure they really want to hear any of that. And so it's an uphill battle to be heard about this. And I don't have any axe to grind. I've just gone where the evidence took me. And it takes me right to Joe Kennedy's doorstep. And, as I say, to a jury, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10, and I think lay out for them in common sense ways how this all came down, how it all happened. And that's why I hope at some point there will be a reinvestigation of the assassinations.
Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
Realistic? No, frankly. I haven't heard from a soul. I sent the letters and the books out to a bunch of politicians, also to the Kennedy family, because I want them to know what I thought, that this all should be reinvestigated. I haven't heard from anyone. I don't know if I will. But you know as well as I do, you're a man who's out there trying to find the truth about things. If you don't try, you never know.
Absolutely.
I'm somebody, I believe in this. I'm not about to say that I have all the answers, but I believe if a new Judiciary Committee investigation took place and all of the evidence could be considered, that somehow or another, for history's sake, we would get to the bottom of this, and that's what I still hope will happen.
Well, I do find it somewhat incongruous that people, as you say, certain people, most people don't want to hear the theories of any kind of responsibility from Joe P. Kennedy, the father of the victim. I guess that just is anathema to so many people. But those same people are aware of the fact that we don't really know for sure what happened here. So all avenues must be examined. Now, I'm wondering, do you have any information about Jack Ruby's thoughts on not being able to testify? You described very well in the book that when it seemed like the jury had come back into the room not looking at him and not looking at Melvin Belli, that Belli leaned over and said, "It's bad." And, obviously Ruby was greatly upset that he was probably going to die, if not spend the rest of his life in prison. What were his thoughts? Did he say anything about, hey, why didn't you get me up on the stand? I have so much to say about this.
Well, I have some real sympathy for Jack Ruby, frankly. I think he was brought in with an order. You'll read a police officer in there who was right with Ruby after he shot Oswald, and Ruby was waiting to hear whether Oswald was dead or not. And the guy said he was nervous, he was smoking, he was this and he was that, but when he heard Oswald was dead, he relaxed. So, he wanted to make sure he'd done what he was supposed to do. His first visitor then to the jail cell is Joe Campisi, who's linked to Carlos Marcello in Dallas. And it's my belief, and from another person who was there, who says basically he thinks that Ruby was told, help is on the way. We're bringing in a lawyer that will take care of you. And Ruby knew of Belli because Ruby was a big fan of Mickey Cohen, and Belli had practiced law in Dallas with a case that he had there before the Ruby case. So Ruby is sitting there thinking, hey, I'm okay. Oswald was killed. I did what I was supposed to. I've gotten paid. He had some extra money and things like that, I believe. And then he's feeling good because I got the best lawyer coming in the world. And that's why he trusted Belli. And that's why he let Belli use this insanity defense, because, as he said, Belli must have known best. Belli told him, no, you shouldn't testify because you'll make a fool of yourself up there. Well, Ruby was fine with that, too, because he trusted Melvin Belli, and all the way along the line. What he didn't know, that was even during the trial, have a quote from Belli to a friend of his chauffeur, where Belli said, basically, the Ruby trial is fixed. We're just going through the motions. It's a whitewash. And, you hate to tarnish a man's reputation, because Belli did a lot of good in his life. But in this case, he sold his client down the river, and I believe that Belli may have had no choice to do that. His private life, even his public life, a lot of things that Melvin Belli did could have come back to haunt him. And maybe they had something they were holding over Belli where they said, look, we need you to do this and everything. So
what kind of things?
Place, but I feel very badly for Jack Ruby.
Well, what kind of things are you alluding to that Melvin Belli had held over him?
Well, Belli was a loose cannon. He was married 6 times. He ran around with a lot of different people on the edge of crime. He loved the Mafia, and the Mafia loved him. That's one quote from the book. Mm-hmm. Belli was big in Las Vegas. He loved to go over there and just mingle with the Mafia of the day. Is there the possibility that he had huge gambling debts? Nobody can seem to figure out exactly what happened there. There are real question marks about his private life and, who he might have been involved with that way. His client, Mickey Cohen, as you know, was a cold-blooded gangster. Did Belli have something to do with any of those crimes? I would like to believe, in my own mind, that Belli didn't do what he did, which was a real disservice to Jack Ruby, unless there was something hanging over his head, because otherwise he should have been disbarred for what he did with Ruby, because Ruby didn't have his constitutional rights to counsel. He had nobody in his corner that was fighting for him. In fact, he had somebody that was not fighting for him right there.
All right, tell us your understanding of what actually did happen to Jack Ruby after.
Okay, Ruby is convicted and got the death penalty, and you'll hear the foreman of the jury say we couldn't believe Ruby didn't testify. You'll hear Ruby say, I had no defense. So on and so forth. So Ruby is taken to prison. He tries to commit suicide 3 times. He's brought before Chief Justice Earl Warren. He talks to Earl Warren. You may remember that famous photo of actually it's a video of Ruby saying, I have been used for a purpose. No one will ever know the motives, and so on and so forth. And telling Earl Warren, I need to go to Washington to talk to the president. I need to go get me out of here. And Warren saying, look, you're safe here. And Ruby saying, no, I'm not. All of that, okay. He even took a lie detector test. And the questions and answers he had, J. Edgar Hoover handled that by saying, there's no way that that's valid because this man has a mental problem. So Ruby was yelling and screaming in some ways about, hey, somebody needs to listen to me, but nobody was going to with the poor guy because he had been portrayed as crazy. He finally died of cancer, and there's one quote in the book that I will never forget from a friend of Melvin Belli's. When Belli learned that Ruby had died, Ruby said to this man, you know what? I wonder if they injected him with cancer cells. So, it's the little things that mean a lot in this case, and when people read the book, I've got, I think, 23 or 24 instances of questions about Belli's representation of Ruby. And if you focus on Ruby and then look back toward Joe Kennedy through Marcello, Cohen, all the way up to Bobby and Joe, I think people will find that makes an awful lot of sense.
There was also the issue, we covered this earlier in this call on the show here, with that the margin of victory for John F. Kennedy winning the election against Nixon was very slim in a couple of states, and there were always the allegations that somehow either Joe Kennedy or the mob and Joe Kennedy had something to do with a rigged vote.
Yeah, there's no question about that. The evidence is there from many sources. You know, this is a story about abuse of power and corruption and money. And I must tell you, I see some similarities today. We don't know where the money's coming from in a lot of these elections anymore in the United States or anywhere else. You know, with the Supreme Court decision allowing corporations to donate, we don't know on either the left or the right or the middle or wherever it is where the money's coming from. And that's what happened in 1960. The money and the power there tilted that election, and it tilted it towards Jack Kennedy away from Richard Nixon. And that shouldn't happen. And maybe we need to learn from what happened back then to watch more closely these days as to where that money's coming from.
Yeah, well, you didn't think that there was a good likelihood that they would crack this open and take your evidence and others into account to get another look at it. And I'm very skeptical that any kind of purification of the election process would take place. You're exactly right. It was 1960 when that happened, and I'm pretty sure you could find a lot of evidence since, including both Bush elections, and it goes on and on.
Yeah, I think so, and you know that's a tragedy in many ways. But look, that's 50 years ago, and it continues on today. And maybe we need to learn from what happened back then. That the Joe Kennedys, those guys behind the scenes. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but John Kennedy wasn't the president of the United States. Joe Kennedy was. And Joe influenced John Kennedy in terms of all the things that he did and the things that he didn't do. Joe Kennedy was a bad guy. He was a bad guy. And, you know, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. Joe was a philanderer. His sons were philanderers. Joe decided he could do anything he wanted to and get away with it. Bobby Kennedy was especially like that. He made going after the Mafia, personal, not business. And you can't do that with dangerous men. So with all due respect to the Kennedy family, there's a reap what thou shalt sow spiritual element to this book. Actions have consequences, and in my opinion, John Kennedy should never have died. When Bobby Kennedy said, I thought they would get one of this, I thought it would be me, he is right. It should have been him. I mean, unfortunately,
right.
I'm glad it wasn't. And it shouldn't have been John either. But if it was one of the Kennedy brothers who was going to be assassinated, Bobby Kennedy is right. It should have been him.
Now, again, though, I have to look to, going back to Jack Ruby, that to me, from my position where I sit in history, it's very odd to me, even taking into account the information that I've gotten from your book, that this guy who is a mobster himself or hangs around mobsters and has a couple of nightclubs is able to get into the police station where they're doing the transfer of Lee Harvey Oswald in the first place. I mean, it still beggars belief to me that happened.
Well, you talked about the Warren Commission. One of their findings was that Jack Ruby didn't have anything to do with the mob, and also that he didn't have anything to do with police officers. Well, when the House Select Committee in the 70s looked at it, I mean, they were, it was that evidence was just absent from the Warren Commission, but they found all of these connections. I mean, Ruby was a police wannabe as well. He got into that Friday night news conference where they paraded Oswald out there. He was right there. He was talking to Henry Wade, the prosecutor. He was talking to the police. He knew all those guys because all those police had been to his nightclubs. Well, it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to believe that if the mob, with Carlos Marcello masterminding thing through Campisi and Dallas and all of that, went to Ruby and said, this is what we want to do, that they used their police connections to get Ruby in there. There are police officers who say that there's no way, that he could have just eased himself in there. Somebody let him in and let him get close to Oswald where he killed that man. There's too many coincidences that you'd have to come up with to explain that. Otherwise, what you've got to do is use common sense and say Ruby was supposed to kill Oswald, and he was aided by these police officers and detectives, whoever it may be, to get close to Oswald. And then you're probably going to say, well, why would Ruby do that? Because he knew he was going to be captured or killed. Well, he would have been a hero, obviously, to many people if he'd been killed, but he knew if he was going to be arrested that help was going to be on the way. I think he had been told that. We'll get you the best lawyer, and we'll get you out of this. The
government is here, and we've come to help you. That old line. Only it's the mob this time around.
Exactly.
Oh man! So this has been a real eye opener for me, because it's like you say, you kind of give it away earlier in the book. It's not about why JFK was killed; it's about why Bobby wasn't at the time. And
yes,
I think you've set that up very well. Tell us about you've broken your book down into 5 different books with an epilogue. I like the Enemies Galore. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Bobby Kennedy was Bobby Kennedy, and John was running for president, so Bobby was his campaign manager. But even before that, Bobby was the counsel for the McClellan Committee, which looked into the rackets as well, the underworld. Mm-hmm. And he really made enemies even there with James Hoffa, with Marcello, with Mickey Cohen. There's a great photograph in the book of Marcello and Mickey Cohen. If you want a connection, they're sitting at the same table. And it's amazing to me, too. If you want to look, devious, just wear sunglasses. Committee hearing, and there's Marcello with his sunglasses on, and Mickey Cohen's across the table, and they look like they'd like to kill whoever is
singing,
examining them, and that's Bobby Kennedy. So now Joe makes JFK appoint Bobby Attorney General. Well, nobody thought Bobby should be Attorney General. He'd never tried a case in court. He was barely a lawyer. So what does Bobby say to himself? I've got to show everybody that I can do this. And so what's the first thing he does? The natural thing. He goes after the Mafia.
The biggest thing you could go after.
Same guys that he had gone after before. It's very predictable when you think about it.
Now, there's a sense there of
enemies with those guys, especially Marcello.
There's a sense there of the, as you were saying earlier, about going against the mob. That there might have been a sense of entitlement, or the mob has already used the Kennedys in a way that they appreciate, and then all of a sudden this young upstart is snapping back at them.
Absolutely, and you'll read in the book the reactions. It was like a punch in the gut. It was a shock. I mean, they couldn't believe that Bobby Kennedy had become Attorney General. They knew, that what he would do. And again, it's their impression of the deal. Even if Joe Kennedy didn't feel like he had a deal, or if Bobby and John didn't know so much about everything, but I think they probably did, but if they didn't, it's the impression that the Mafia had that they had a deal. And when Joe, is behind the scenes and Bobby Kennedy becomes Attorney General, what are they going to do? They're going to strike back. What's the Mafia going to do when the lawyer for Angelo Bruno talks to me too much about Angelo Bruno and the Mafia? They're going to strike back. And the way they strike back, as you know, they take care of their own. And when that happens, they take care of those people who have double-crossed them, and they do so in a violent way. And that's what caused the senseless death of John Kennedy.
Yeah. You get into your book as well about Dorothy Kilgallen, who was, let's say, taken out at some point, and that she had actually covered the Ruby trial and became friends with Melvin Belli. Now, forgive me if you can refresh me on the timeline of when Dorothy Kilgallen was killed, but she had, many believe, a lot of information and also needed to be silenced. And I find it fascinating that she became friendly with Melvin, and they ate together, and they spoke together on private terms. What can you tell us more about Dorothy that we haven't heard already in other books and reports?
Well, it's a pleasure to be on your show because obviously you've done your homework, and I appreciate it. Dorothy Kilgallen is a most interesting character in all of this. She was a famous person at the time of the Ruby trial. She was a panelist on What's My Line, which was a popular television show, and she wrote for the New York Observer. And she was fascinated by Ruby killing Oswald and came to the trial. In my own mind, Belli hit on about every woman he ever met, so I assume he hit on her, and they became very close friends. I don't know if they were lovers or not, but they became close friends. And to the point where she got the only 2 quick interviews with Jack Ruby during the trial. Dorothy Kilgallen then wrote some columns that were very upsetting to people about Ruby's testifying with the Warren Commission after the trial, and she did some other things that upset some people. But in New York City, she was ready to go and look more into the investigation of what Ruby had done. And where was she headed, according to all of her friends? She was headed to New Orleans. And whatever Ruby told her led her in that direction, and who lived in New Orleans but Carlos Marcello. Shortly before she was going to make that trip, she was found dead of an overdose of drugs, they said, in her apartment. Mysterious death to most people. They wondered about that because she had said to some people, what I know might get me killed. Well, that's one statement. Another one was by Melvin Belli to another friend that I interviewed personally, and he said, when Belli learned of Dorothy Kilgallen's death, he said, they got her, now they'll go after Ruby. They got her, now they'll go after Ruby. And it was only a few months later that Ruby died. So Belli had suspicions about Dorothy Kilgallen's death. And again, it's one of those little points that if I were a prosecutor standing in front of a judge, I would lay those out for people and say, is all of this just coincidence, or is it really weaving together the little parts of this into a circumstantial evidence case that would convict those people that we are trying, in this courtroom. And so Dorothy Kilgallen is a most interesting character, and nobody has ever followed up much on her participation in all of this.
No, she's definitely a key player. I wonder if there's a book on her. There seems to be no end of possibilities of writing books about all of this, and she is definitely an interesting character along the way, and unfortunately murdered. Again,
overdose of drugs was supposedly the cause of death, but she didn't really have a drug problem. There's all kinds of things that point to something fishy going on there, but that investigation went nowhere as well.
All right, well, let's wind it up with the ultimate responsibility is the penultimate chapter in your book before the epilogue, and I think we've already gotten your idea of where the ultimate responsibility lies, but just break that open for us a little bit before we get going.
Well, there's a scene in the book that I describe, and it's Joe Kennedy, had the stroke. He can barely even speak, if at all, and he's in his room in Hyannisport, his house, and they're trying to figure out how to tell him that John's been killed. And so Ted Kennedy comes with his wife, and they go up to the room, and they haven't let him watch television, and Ted tells him that John is dead. And then they show him the New York Times. They also give him the New York Times that has the headline there. And Joe jerks back, and his tears start coming out of his eyes. And he takes his left hand, which is nearly paralyzed, and sweeps the paper off of the bed. And in my opinion, 2 people knew for certain who killed John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy and Joe Kennedy. Joe must have realized that his actions had consequences, that ordering JFK to appoint Bobby Attorney General and then Bobby going after those guys was not going to be tolerated, and that their striking back was predictable. And I think Joe Kennedy had to live with that, as Bobby had to live with it until he was assassinated. And ironically, Joe Kennedy outlived both of his sons, but in a state of mind where the guilt must have just been so severe, because I really believe that he knew that it was his actions that had caused the death of JFK. And later on then, of course, he lost Bobby as well.
Yeah, not much of a surprise then that the Kennedy clan, what remains of them, doesn't really want to talk with you about it.
No, but I want them to know. I sent them the books. I want them to give a heads up, and maybe one day I'll hear from them. We'll see.
Well, I hope so, and I do hope that, hope against hope, that your efforts and those of others with more information that was so far either ignored or unheard of at the time manages to turn things around, because, as I say, I believe it to be an incredibly powerful turning point in our history. Obviously, going through your book, you do too. I've been speaking with Mark Shaw, just a fascinating, concise book with a fresh point of view, at least fresh to me, and I'm sure fresh to many others. Where can we get your book, Mark? Or did I just say bookmark?
Yes, you did.
Sorry about that. Mark, where can we get your book?
It should be in all the bookstores and Amazon, of course, online and all of that. And what I hope is that people will read it and then, get back to me as far as their thoughts about it. Again, it's my contribution to history, and I hope that it will permit a new look at a different kind of look at what happened back 50 years ago.
Well, I hope people do get in touch with you, and if they want to do that, you're on Twitter at the Mark Shaw, THE
Correct.
Mark Shaw. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck with your book, and I hope to. I'm going to follow this up my own self and see how much more information regarding Joe that I can turn over.
Sounds good.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Please offer comments or complaints by emailing conspiracyqueries@gmail.com or on Twitter at @con_queries or at our website, conspiracyqueries.com. Thanks for listening.